The morning after. The town of Black Hollow woke up to an ordinary September morning. The sun rose over the dense forest that surrounded the town, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. Birds chirped, the bakery on Main Street wafted the scent of fresh bread into the air, and children laughed as they walked to school. But something was off, terribly off. At first, no one could quite put their finger on it. The calendar on the wall of the diner still read September 12, 2022, but the date felt wrong. The newspapers stacked outside the general store were dated correctly, yet the headlines seemed unfamiliar. The townspeople exchanged uneasy glances, their conversations laced with confusion. Hadn't it just been September 12, 2021? Yesterday? Why did it feel like a whole year had vanished? Ellie Carter, a freelance journalist who had moved to Black Hollow 2 years ago for its quiet charm, noticed the strange tension in the air as she sipped her coffee at the diner. She had been working on a piece about the town's annual harvest festival, but now her reporter's instincts were buzzing. Something was wrong, and she was determined to figure out what. As she walked down Main Street, she overheard snippets of conversation. "Didn't we just celebrate New Year's?" One woman muttered to her friend. "I swear my son was in kindergarten yesterday, but now he's in first grade," another man said, shaking his head. Ellie's curiosity deepened. She pulled out her notebook and began jotting down the inconsistencies. By midday, the unease had turned to panic. The town's mayor, Harold Jenkins, called an emergency meeting at the community center. Ellie was there, front and center, her camera slung around her neck and her notebook at the ready. The room was packed, the air thick with tension. "People of Black Hollow," Mayor Jenkins began, his voice trembling slightly. "It seems we've all experienced a collective lapse in memory. A year of our lives has gone missing. I don't know how or why, but we need to stay calm and figure this out together." The room erupted in murmurs. Ellie raised her hand. "Mayor Jenkins, has anyone checked the town records? Or contacted authorities outside Black Hollow? Maybe this isn't just happening here." The mayor hesitated. "We've tried. The phones are down and the roads, they're blocked. Trees have fallen and the bridges are out. It's like we're cut off from the rest of the world." Ellie's mind raced. A missing year. Town cut off. This was more than just a strange coincidence. She needed to dig deeper. That evening, Ellie sat in her small apartment above the bookstore, surrounded by stacks of old newspapers and town records. She had spent hours cross-referencing dates, but nothing added up. The last clear memory anyone had was September 12, 2021. After that, it was as if the town had skipped forward in time. As she sifted through the papers, she found something odd. A single photograph tucked between the pages of a ledger. It was a group of townspeople standing in front of the old clock tower, but the clock was broken, its hands frozen at 3:17. The date scrawled on the back of the photo read, September 12, 2022. Ellie's heart raced. This was proof. Something had happened on that date, something significant enough to break the clock and erase a year of memories. But what? She decided to visit the clock tower the next morning. As she lay in bed that night, her mind buzzed with questions. What had happened during that missing year? And why had it been erased? The clock tower. The next morning, Ellie woke up early, her mind still racing from the discoveries of the previous night. She grabbed her camera, notebook, and a flashlight, then headed to the old clock tower at the edge of town. The tower had been a Black Hollow landmark for over a century, its once grand facade now weathered and crumbling. As she approached, she noticed something strange. The clock's hands were still frozen at 3:17, just like in the photograph. The door to the tower was slightly ajar, its hinges creaking in the cool morning breeze. Ellie hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and old metal. She flicked on her flashlight and began to climb the narrow spiral staircase that led to the clock mechanism. As she ascended, she noticed strange markings on the walls, symbols etched into the stone, glowing faintly in the beam of her flashlight. They looked ancient, almost ritualistic, and sent a shiver down her spine. She snapped a few photos, making a mental note to research the symbols later. When she reached the top of the tower, she found the clock's mechanism in disarray. Gears were bent and broken, and the pendulum hung motionless. But what caught her eye was a small metal box tucked behind the machinery. It was covered in dust, but the symbols on its surface matched those on the walls. Ellie carefully opened the box and found a stack of papers inside. They were handwritten notes, filled with frantic scribbles and diagrams. The words temporal anomaly and memory suppression jumped out at her. She flipped through the pages, her hands trembling as she realized what she was holding: a record of experiments conducted during the missing year. According to the notes, a group of scientists had come to Black Hollow to study a strange phenomenon occurring in the forest outside town. They had discovered a rift in time, a place where the past, present, and future seemed to collide. The townspeople had initially welcomed the scientists, eager to see what they might uncover. But something had gone terribly wrong. The notes grew increasingly erratic, detailing failed experiments and unintended consequences. The final entry was dated September 12, 2022, and consisted of a single sentence: "We had to erase it all, for their sake." Ellie's mind reeled. The missing year hadn't been an accident. It had been deliberate. Someone had erased the memories of the entire town to hide a catastrophic event. But what had happened? And why had the scientists felt the need to take such drastic measures? As she descended the tower, Ellie's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden flash of memory. A vision of the forest, bathed in an eerie green light, and the sound of screams echoing through the trees. She stumbled, clutching the railing for support. The memory was vivid, almost tangible, but it vanished as quickly as it had come. When she stepped outside, she found a small crowd gathered at the base of the tower. Among them was Dr. Evelyn Marsh, the town's retired physician and one of the few people Ellie trusted. Dr. Marsh had always been a pillar of the community, known for her calm demeanor and sharp intellect. "Ellie," Dr. Marsh said, her voice low and urgent, "we need to talk. Alone." Ellie followed her to a nearby bench, where Dr. Marsh handed her a small, leather-bound journal. "I found this in my attic this morning," she said. "It's mine, but I don't remember writing it. It's from the missing year." Ellie opened the journal and began to read. The entries detailed Dr. Marsh's involvement with the scientists, her growing concerns about their experiments, and her decision to help them erase the town's memories. The final entry was a warning. "The rift is still there. It's unstable. If anyone remembers, it could reopen." Ellie looked up, her heart pounding. "Do you think the flashes of memory people are having, the visions, could be connected to the rift?" Dr. Marsh nodded grimly. "I think the suppression is breaking down, and if it fails completely, we could be in grave danger." Ellie's mind raced. She had uncovered the truth, but now she faced an impossible choice. Should she help the town remember what had happened, risking the reopening of the rift? Or should she let the past stay buried, even if it meant living with a lie, the fractured memories? Ellie sat on the bench with Dr. Marsh, the weight of the journal heavy in her hands. The sun was rising higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the town square, but the warmth of the morning did little to ease the chill that had settled in her bones. She looked at Dr. Marsh, whose face was etched with worry. "What do we do now?" Ellie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "If the suppression is breaking down, people are going to start remembering. And if the rift reopens?" Dr. Marsh sighed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I don't know, Ellie. I truly don't. But we can't keep this hidden forever. The truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how hard we try to bury it." Ellie nodded, her mind racing. She needed more information. If the rift was still out there, unstable and dangerous, she had to find it. And if the scientists who had caused all of this were still around, she needed to track them down. But first, she had to decide how much to tell the townspeople. As if on cue, a commotion broke out near the clock tower. A man was shouting, his voice frantic. Ellie and Dr. Marsh hurried over to find Tom Grady, the town's mechanic, clutching his head and swaying on his feet. His face was pale, and his eyes were wide with terror. "I saw it," he stammered, his voice trembling. The forest, the light, it was everywhere. And the screams, I heard them. I was there. The crowd murmured uneasily, some stepping back while others tried to calm Tom down. Ellie exchanged a glance with Dr. Marsh. The flashes of memory were getting stronger, more vivid. It was only a matter of time before others started experiencing them too. Ellie stepped forward, her reporter's instincts kicking in. Tom, can you tell us what you saw? Anything at all? Tom shook his head, his hands still pressed to his temples. It's all jumbled, but I remember running. Something was chasing us. Something we couldn't see. The crowd grew restless, the fear palpable. Ellie knew she had to act fast. She turned to Dr. Marsh. We need to gather everyone. We can't keep this a secret anymore. People deserve to know what's happening. Dr. Marsh hesitated, then nodded. You're right, but we need to be careful. If we scare them too much, it could make things worse. By midday, the entire town had gathered in the community center. The room was packed, the air thick with tension. Ellie stood at the front, her heart pounding as she prepared to address the crowd. She had decided to tell them the truth, or at least as much of it as she could without causing panic. People of Black Hollow, she began, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. Something happened to us. A year of our lives was erased, and we're only now starting to remember. But the truth is dangerous. If we remember too much, it could put all of us at risk. The room erupted in murmurs, some people shouting questions while others looked on in stunned silence. Ellie held up her hands, urging them to listen. I don't have all the answers yet, but I promise you, I'm going to find them, and I'm going to do everything I can to keep us safe. As the meeting continued, Ellie noticed a man standing at the back of the room. He was tall and thin, with sharp features and piercing blue eyes. He didn't look like he was from Black Hollow, and he was watching her intently. When their eyes met, he gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod before slipping out the door. Ellie's curiosity was piqued. She excused herself from the meeting and followed him outside. The man was standing by the old oak tree in the square, his hands in his pockets. He looked up as she approached. You're Ellie Carter, the journalist, he said, his voice calm and measured. I've been waiting for you. Ellie frowned. Who are you? My name is Victor Kane, he said. I was part of the team that came here to study the rift, and I'm the one who erased your memories. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. She had so many questions, but before she could ask any of them, Victor held up a hand. There's no time to explain everything now, but if you want to save this town, you need to come with me. The rift is still out there, and it's more dangerous than ever. Ellie hesitated. She didn't trust this man, but she needed answers. And if he was telling the truth, he might be the only one who could help her. Where are we going? She asked. Victor's expression darkened. To the forest, to the heart of the rift. The heart of the rift. Ellie followed Victor Kane into the forest, her mind a whirlwind of questions and doubts. The trees loomed tall and dense, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant call of a crow. Victor moved with purpose, his strides long and confident, as if he knew exactly where he was going. How far is it? Ellie asked, struggling to keep up. Her camera bounced against her chest, and her notebook was tucked securely in her jacket pocket. Not far, Victor replied, his voice low. But we need to be careful. The rift's energy is unpredictable. Can affect people. Ellie frowned. Affect them how? Victor glanced back at her, his blue eyes piercing. You've already felt it, haven't you? The flashes of memory, the visions. The closer we get to the rift, the stronger they'll become. As if on cue, Ellie's head began to throb. She stumbled, clutching her temples as another vision washed over her. She saw the forest bathed in that same eerie green light, the trees twisting and warping as if alive. She heard the screams again, louder this time, and felt a cold, primal fear grip her heart. When the vision passed, she was on her knees, gasping for breath. Victor knelt beside her, his hand on her shoulder. "You okay?" Ellie nodded, though her hands were still trembling. "What is that? What's causing it?" "The rift," Victor said, helping her to her feet. "It's a tear in the fabric of time and space. We don't fully understand it, but we know it's dangerous. That's why we had to erase everyone's memories. The things we saw, the things we experienced, they were too much for the human mind to handle." Ellie's stomach churned. "What happened out here, Victor? What did you see?" Victor's expression darkened, and for a moment, he looked almost haunted. "I'll show you," he said quietly, "but you need to prepare yourself. What you're about to see, it's not easy to forget." They continued deeper into the forest, the air growing colder and heavier with each step. The trees seemed to close in around them, their gnarled roots twisting like serpents across the forest floor. Ellie's senses were on high alert, every sound and movement magnified. She could feel the rift's presence now, a low, pulsing hum that seemed to resonate in her bones. Finally, they reached a clearing. At its center was a massive, jagged crack in the ground, glowing faintly with that same green light Ellie had seen in her visions. The air around it shimmered like a heat mirage, and the ground was littered with strange, metallic fragments that looked like pieces of a broken machine. "This is it," Victor said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The heart of the rift." Ellie stepped closer, her heart pounding. She could feel the rift's energy now, a strange, magnetic pull that made her skin tingle. She raised her camera and began taking photos, her reporter's instincts kicking in despite the fear gnawing at her. "What happened here?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What went wrong?" Victor hesitated, then sighed. "We thought we could control it. We thought we could harness its power. But we were wrong. The rift, it's alive in a way. It reacts to us, to our thoughts, our emotions. And when we tried to manipulate it, it fought back." Ellie's eyes widened. "Fought back how?" Victor's jaw tightened. "It showed us things, terrible things. Visions of the past, the future, alternate realities. Some of us couldn't handle it. They lost their minds. Others were pulled into the rift and never came back. We had no choice but to shut it down and erase everyone's memories." Ellie's mind raced. But if the rift is still here, if it's unstable, what happens if it opens again? Victor's expression was grim. "It could destroy the town. Or worse, that's why I came back. To make sure it stays closed." Ellie looked at him, her eyes narrowing. "Why now? Why wait a year to come back?" Victor hesitated, and for the first time, Ellie saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "I didn't have a choice," he said finally. "I was affected by the rift too. Took me this long to recover. But now that I'm here, I need your help to finish what we started." Ellie's instincts screamed at her to be cautious. There was something Victor wasn't telling her, something important. But before she could press him further, a loud crack echoed through the forest. The ground beneath them began to tremble, and the rift's glow intensified, casting eerie shadows across the clearing. "What's happening?" Ellie shouted, struggling to keep her balance. Victor's face paled. "It's reacting to us. We need to go. Now." But it was too late. The rift's light surged, and Ellie was thrown to the ground as a wave of energy washed over her. Her vision blurred, and she felt herself being pulled into the rift, the world around her dissolving into chaos. The edge of time, Ellie felt as though she were falling, tumbling through a void where time and space had no meaning. Colors and shapes swirled around her, indistinct and chaotic, like a storm of broken memories. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her body felt weightless, her mind adrift in a sea of confusion. And then, suddenly, she landed. The ground beneath her was solid, though it shimmered like liquid glass. She gasped for air, her hands clutching at the strange, translucent surface. The world around her was unlike anything she had ever seen. The sky was a swirling vortex of light and shadow, and the landscape was a patchwork of familiar and alien elements. She saw fragments of Black Hollow, the clock tower, the forest, the town square, but they were distorted, as if viewed through a fractured lens. Ellie! She turned to see Victor stumbling toward her, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. He reached out and grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet. "We're inside the rift," he said, his voice trembling. "This is where it takes you. This is where it shows you everything." Ellie's head spun. "What do you mean, everything?" Victor didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to a figure in the distance. It was a man, but his form flickered and shifted, as if he were made of smoke. As they watched, the figure turned and began to walk toward them. With each step, his features became clearer, and Ellie's heart sank as she recognized him. It was Mayor Harold Jenkins. But this wasn't the mayor she knew. This version of him was gaunt and hollow-eyed, his face twisted with despair. He stopped a few feet away and stared at them, his mouth moving as if he were speaking, but no words came out. "What's happening?" Ellie whispered, her voice barely audible. "This is one of the Rift's visions," Victor said. "It shows you possibilities, alternate realities, things that could have been, or might still be." The mayor's figure dissolved into mist, and the landscape shifted. Ellie found herself standing in the town square, but it was eerily empty. The buildings were crumbling, the streets littered with debris. A cold wind blew through the desolate scene, carrying with it the faint sound of weeping. "This is one possible future," Victor said. "If the rift isn't contained, this could happen to Black Hollow." Ellie's chest tightened. "We have to stop it. We have to get out of here and close the rift for good." Victor nodded, but his expression was grim. "It's not that simple. The rift doesn't want to be closed. It'll fight us every step of the way." As if on cue, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The sky darkened, and the air grew thick with static. Ellie felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread, as if the rift itself were alive and aware of their presence. "We need to find the core," Victor said, grabbing her hand. "It's the only way to shut it down." They ran through the shifting landscape, the world around them twisting and changing with each step. Ellie saw glimpses of other realities, versions of Black Hollow where the town thrived, where it was destroyed, where it never existed at all. Each vision was more disorienting than the last, and she struggled to keep her focus. Finally, they reached a massive, pulsating sphere of light. It hovered above the ground, its surface rippling like water. Ellie could feel its power, a raw, chaotic energy that made her skin crawl. "This is it," Victor said. "The core of the rift. If we can destabilize it, we can close the rift for good." Ellie hesitated. "How do we do that?" Victor's expression was grim. "We have to disrupt its energy. But it's dangerous. The rift will try to stop us." Before Ellie could respond, the ground beneath them cracked open, and tendrils of light shot up from the fissure. They wrapped around Victor's legs, pulling him down. He struggled, his face contorted with pain. "Ellie, go!" he shouted. "You have to do it." Ellie's heart raced. She looked at the core, then back at Victor. She couldn't leave him, but she couldn't let the rift destroy the town either. Summoning all her courage, she ran toward the core, her hands outstretched. As she reached it, she felt a surge of energy course through her body. Visions flooded her mind, memories of the missing year, of the experiments, of the moment the rift was created. She saw the scientists, their faces filled with fear and regret. She saw the townspeople, their memories being erased. And she saw Victor, standing at the edge of the rift, his eyes filled with determination. With a cry, Ellie pushed her hands into the core. The energy surged around her, and she felt herself being pulled into the light. But she held on, focusing all her will on one thought: close the rift. The world exploded in a blinding flash of light. The choice when the light faded, Ellie found herself lying on the forest floor, the cold ground pressing against her back. The air was still, the eerie green glow of the rift gone. She sat up slowly, her head pounding and her body aching as if she had just run a marathon. The forest around her was quiet, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Victor was nowhere to be seen. Ellie scrambled to her feet, her heart racing. "Victor?" she called, her voice echoing through the trees. There was no response. She turned in a circle, scanning the clearing, but there was no sign of him, no footprints, no trace of his presence. It was as if he had vanished. The rift, too, was gone. The jagged crack in the ground had sealed itself, leaving only a faint scar in the earth. The metallic fragments that had littered the clearing were now dull and lifeless, their strange energy extinguished. Ellie knelt and touched the ground where the rift had been, half expecting it to pulse beneath her fingers, but it was cold and still. She had done it. She had closed the rift. But at what cost? Ellie's mind raced as she stumbled back toward town. Her body felt heavy, her thoughts sluggish, as if the rift had drained her of something vital. She replayed the final moments in her head. Victor being pulled into the light, her hands plunging into the core, the blinding flash that had followed. Had he sacrificed himself to help her, or had the rift taken him as punishment for trying to destroy it? When she reached the edge of the forest, the town of Black Hollow came into view. It looked the same as it always had, quaint, peaceful, untouched by the chaos she had just experienced. But as she walked down Main Street, she noticed something strange. The townspeople were gathered in small groups, their faces pale and their voices hushed. Some were crying, others staring into the distance as if in a daze. Ellie approached Mrs. Henderson, the elderly owner of the general store, who was sitting on a bench outside her shop. "What's going on?" Ellie asked, her voice trembling. Mrs. Henderson looked up, her eyes red and watery. It's all coming back," she said. "The memories, the year we lost. I remember now. I remember everything." Ellie's heart sank. The suppression had broken. The town's memories of the missing year were returning, and with them, the trauma of what had happened. She saw flashes of it in their eyes. The fear, the confusion, the pain. The rift might be gone, but its effects were far from over. She made her way to the community center, where Mayor Jenkins was addressing a crowd. His face was ashen, his hands shaking as he spoke. "We need to stay calm," he said, though his voice betrayed his own panic. "We'll figure this out together. Mayor," Ellie interrupted, stepping forward. "I know what happened. I know about the rift." The crowd turned to her, their eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. Mayor Jenkins stared at her for a moment, then nodded. "Tell us," he said quietly. Ellie took a deep breath and began to explain. She told them about the scientists, the experiments, the rift's creation, and the catastrophic event that had followed. She told them about the memory suppression, the flashes of memory, and her journey into the heart of the rift. And she told them about Victor, how he had helped her close the rift, even if it meant sacrificing himself. When she finished, the room was silent. The weight of the truth hung heavy in the air, and Ellie could see the toll it was taking on the townspeople. Some looked angry, others heartbroken. A few simply stared at her, their faces blank with shock. "What do we do now?" someone asked, their voice breaking. Ellie hesitated. She had closed the rift, but the town's wounds were far from healed. The memories of the missing year would haunt them for the rest of their lives, and there was no easy way to move forward. But as she looked around the room, she saw something else in their eyes: resilience. These were people who had endured unimaginable pain, and yet they were still standing, still fighting. "We rebuild," Ellie said finally. "We remember what happened, but we don't let it define us. We honor the lives that were lost, and we make sure nothing like this ever happens again." The room was quiet for a moment, and then, slowly, people began to nod. Mayor Jenkins stepped forward and placed a hand on Ellie's shoulder. "Thank you," he said, "for everything." Ellie nodded, though her heart was heavy. She had saved the town, but the cost had been high. And as she left the community center and walked back to her apartment, she couldn't shake the feeling that the rift's influence wasn't entirely gone. The visions she had seen, the memories she had recovered, they lingered in her mind, like shadows at the edge of her consciousness. That night, as she lay in bed, Ellie stared at the ceiling, her thoughts racing. She had uncovered the truth. but it had come at a price. The town would never be the same, and neither would she. And as she closed her eyes, she couldn't help but wonder if the rift had truly been destroyed, or if it was simply waiting, biding its time until it could rise again.